getting away with murder. How do we ensure those who commit atrocities face justice? There is an international court for war crimes and human rights violations, but more and more perpetrators are escaping punishment. So how can we hold them to account? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Murder, war crimes, crimes against humanity, including genocide. These are some of the worst atrocities under international law, from conflicts to the persecution of minorities because of religion or ethnicity. The world is facing more instances of human rights violations, and increasingly, the people responsible are getting away with them. Qatar is holding a two-day conference on the issue, attended by more than 250 representatives from the UN, EU and various rights organisations. They're discussing ways to ensure the perpetrators of such crimes don't escape justice and are held to account. There are calls for the UN to appoint a special rapporteur to combat impunity. The UN's human rights chief says there can't be peace if those responsible for crimes don't face justice.
Societies that undergo conflicts or face authoritarian regimes must have their grievances addressed. In our office, we receive first-hand accounts of men, women, and children who have been subjected to the most horrific crimes: massacres, torture, sexual violence, displacement, starvation, denial of access to basic medical care and to education. We must do more to bring the perpetrator of these crimes to justice and to protect the victims. Victims have a right to truth, justice and reparation. To attain sustainable peace and reconciliation, this is a must.
Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed has more from the conference in Doha.
Basic human rights and civil rights exist on the statutes of most countries in the world, but human rights workers and activists say that they're constantly being pummeled upon. A gathering of more than 250 representatives of non-government organizations as well as stakeholders from various parts of the world have gathered here in Doha to discuss efforts to try and end that impunity with which rights are floundered. People here have been talking about rights of in combat zones in places like Syria and Yemen to Libya and other areas where there are sprouting sense of achievement by the people, similar to what is happening in Sudan and Algeria. This is what the organizers have been telling us that they've been trying to achieve, is to bring people under one roof where these ideas can be formulated into a framework which can be then presented and to various human rights organizations in the world who can try and see how these basic rights can be given to the people. And we've been hearing stories of frustration from activists from all over the world who say that yes, there have been conferences, but these tend to become echo chambers of similar voices, and the people who are actually carrying out the violations of these rights are never part of these conferences. And that remains to be the challenge in not just conflict zones, but other parts of the world where the right to assembly, the right to free speech, the right to housing, or various other rights are not being adhered to. So this is what activists have been telling us, that they want the world, especially in the case of Syria, activists say that they want the world to take note of what its inaction has achieved, and they want people to hold responsibility, and then also people who have been violating these rights to be held responsible. For Inside Story, I'm Osama bin Javed in Doha.
Well, let's take a look now at some recent cases. The CIA reportedly concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi last October, but US President Donald Trump has avoided implicating him. Saudi Arabia has detained 11 people, but none of them are the close aides to bin Salman, thought to be involved in Khashoggi's killing. Sudan's deposed leader Omar al-Bashir has evaded 2 international criminal court arrest warrants over war crimes, and the army says it won't extradite him to The Hague. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has been accused of war crimes in the 8-year conflict, but his ally Russia has vetoed UN resolutions to refer the matter to the ICC. Well, let's bring in our panel now. Joining me in the studio is Toby Cadman, international human rights lawyer and barrister at Guernica 37. That's an international law firm. In Beirut is Rami, Khouri, professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut and senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. And also in Doha, joining us from the conference, is Mona Rishmawi, chief of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination branch in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. A very warm welcome to all of you. Ms. Rishmawi, before we talk about in more detail about those specific cases that we mentioned, let me start with a general question to you. Why are we seeing a rise more human rights violations and war crimes? And does impunity and the lack of accountability that mean that such crimes will only continue?
Well, let me just start from perhaps a different point of view that where you actually posed the question. I'm not sure we are seeing more impunity. Actually, we are seeing more awareness that human rights violations are taking place. It's thanks to advocates, to civil society, to human rights defenders, to a lot of special rapporteurs, commissions of inquiry, to a very active Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council. There is wider knowledge about what is going on in the world, and basically we are a lot more aware of what people are going through in different parts of the world. We are much more connected. There is much more information flow, and that, for me, gives us there is an urgency to deal with what we know. The good story is that we have a framework. We have a framework. We have also institutions that are in place, and we can do something about it. We need the political will. We need the support to be able to move forward, and that's actually is the responsibility for all members of the international community to make sure that this is happening.
Okay, so possibly not more crimes being committed, but definitely more awareness of the ones that are. So how do we take that awareness and hold people to account? Mr. Cadman, let's talk about some of the cases that we've already mentioned. There are plenty of big cases of possible impunity, and what can be done. If we look at, the most recent one, the toppling of long-time Sudanese leader OMAR al-Bashir, who's wanted for war crimes, for his role in the deaths of millions of people in Darfur between 2003 and 2008. The military, who are now in charge in Sudan, have said they won't extradite him to The Hague. They will try him. What are the chances that Omar al-Bashir will face a fair trial in Sudan?
Well, it's a big question that the ICC is going to have to deal with now, because as he is indicted by the ICC has jurisdiction. But of course, the ICC operates under a principle of complementarity as a court of last resort. And so it is preferable that cases such as this are tried domestically in the places where the crimes were committed. So as an advocate of justice, an advocate of victims' rights, I always want to see justice in the areas where the crimes were committed. But it's going to be very difficult to put an individual such as al-Bashir on trial, particularly during the current situation with the military rule, and whether there would be a sufficient legal and institutional framework in Sudan to try him in a civilian court that would meet fair trial standards. And that will be one of the questions that the ICC has to ask. When they've been put in the same position as far as Libya is concerned, and they allowed for a trial to go forward in Libya, most international lawyers, such as myself, thought that was an absolutely ridiculous situation. And so I think they're going to have to look very, very carefully at what legal and institutional framework they have in place to put him on trial, that there is not the death penalty, and to what extent the international community will be able to support that. I think the likelihood is that people will want to see him tried in The Hague at the ICC, but it's quite clear that the Sudanese authorities currently in place are not going to hand him over. We also have to understand that the military rulers who are in place are part of a system that have committed crimes over a lengthy period of time. And so they're not going to want to see him handed over to the ICC. And so that's also a problem.
Mr. Khouri, I want to bring you in in on this. I know that you watch events in the region very closely. How do you see what's unfolding in Sudan in relation to Omar al-Bashir? And will what happens to him depend on whether the military stays in power or a civilian government is allowed in?
Those two things will be important, and the great dynamic that's taking place right now in Algeria and in Sudan is a historic, unprecedented, and really pivotal moment when millions and millions of citizens are peacefully trying to actually put into practice the principle of the sovereignty of the people and the consent of the governed. The governance of the Arab world for the last 50 years or so has been dominated by security and military services. And this is what these uprisings have been all about. They started 8 years ago, and now they've reached a dramatic moment again in Algeria and Sudan. If you can get genuine civilian, legitimate, accountable, participatory, and democratic and pluralistic governance, which is what the people want, there's a possibility that we can then refurbish our judicial system and allow for really high-quality courts of international standards. The likelihood of that is there, but it's going to take a long time. In the meantime, the real problem we have with the ICC and the international system is it seems to be a kind of a new form of Western imperialism or colonialism, where basically these institutions are dominated by the permanent members of the Security Council. They ultimately go back to the Security Council in most cases. And the permanent members of the Security Council, Great Britain and the United States and France and Russia, are all actively at war in the Middle East. They're selling billions and billions of dollars of arms. They're actively fighting in places like Yemen and Syria and other places. So and Libya, the French in Libya. And so the idea that the ICC will actually hold accountable people all over the world at an equal level of justice is not a very realistic one, unfortunately. That's why it's been mostly hapless African tyrants who've been put on trial with a couple from former Yugoslavia. So this is the problem that we see, a kind of a double standard. And it's not easy to see how Omar Hassan al-Bashir will be held accountable.
Mr. Cadman, I do want to bring you in on this now because I know that you work, you have a lot to do with the ICC. But before I do, Ms. Rashmami, what do you make of that? The fact that the ICC and who has power in the International Criminal Court make up the permanent members of the UN Security Council who are also involved in different conflicts around the world, including arming conflicting parties.
Well, as perhaps is known, only 3 members of the permanent members of the Security Council are members of the Rome Statute, and there are 2 important members, the US and Russia, which are not party to the Rome Statute.
And that's a problem in itself, isn't it? That's a problem in itself, isn't it? That the United States, that China, that Russia aren't members of the International Criminal Court.
Yes, and I think that is an issue. But as we know, universal treaties take time for them to be totally universal and this is of course very important that all members of the international community, all members become party to the Rome Statute. But that actually, let me answer the issue in a different way. The International Criminal Court takes situations in place. And when it opens investigations, these investigations are either referred to it by the Security Council or a member state itself brings this situation to its attention. 2 situations were referred by the Security Council. This is the situation in Darfur, thanks to a very comprehensive commission of inquiry on Darfur in 2005, and is the situation in Libya. The other situations that are before the International Criminal Court were mostly referred to it by the state itself. The prosecutor took initiative in few situations, but these are not really the big majority of files. So really, it's thanks to the state's cooperation with the International Criminal Court that we have the situations which are being addressed right now in the court.
Okay, I want to talk now about situations and conflicts. Ms. Rashmawi, I'm just going to bring Mr. Cadman in now on a situation that is not being going to be investigated by the International Criminal Court. They ruled just yesterday that that the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, cannot look into war crimes in Afghanistan. Now, they said that it wouldn't serve the interests of justice. If an investigation into crimes against civilians doesn't serve in the interests of justice, I mean, how will justice be served?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the decision by the pretrial chamber in relation to the situation in Afghanistan has been widely condemned by international lawyers around the world, myself included. There are a number of problems with the decision they've reached. First of all, by applying the interest of justice test. Now, the interest of justice test is ordinarily a test that is to be applied by the prosecutor in not opening an investigation. So for the judges of the pretrial chamber to apply that is problematic as to whether it has even jurisdiction to apply such a test. The other issue is, of course, this has come on the back of a very bullying campaign by the United States. And so the message that sends is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, Amnesty International said a craven capitulation to America's bullying.
Absolutely. And this is not the first time we've seen this. We saw this many years ago with the US trying to convince other states not to ratify the Rome Statute. So it's not the first time we've seen that. And we've seen this sort of bullying tactics over a period of time. And so the decision is going to be interpreted in such a way, and that's going to give other states the strength to stand up to the ICC and not cooperate. So that's dangerous in itself. The other issue that has been raised by the ICC, by the pretrial chamber, is the inability to effectively investigate. Now, of course, prosecutors around the world on a national or an international level will always apply a test of whether there is a reasonable prospect of successfully prosecuting a case. So, of course, you look at that. But that's a prosecutor's test, not a judicial determination. And what we are seeing is a situation where there is constant battling between the prosecutor and the judges as to who has the discretion to determine cases. And when we're looking at the inability to investigate, they're talking about the situation in Afghanistan is very different now to when the inquiries first started, the position of the United States not cooperating. But if we go back to some of the other situations that have been investigated, Sudan as an example, there's been no cooperation from the al-Bashir regime. The pretrial chamber 1 had ruled last year that it has jurisdiction in respect of Myanmar by using this new form of jurisdiction, which is very innovative. And the judges were the ones that agreed the prosecutor did have jurisdiction. Our group was one that filed amicus briefs on that, saying that the court does have jurisdiction. And we've now followed that up with a filing in relation to Syria and Jordan. So we want the judges to expand the area of jurisdiction. But so it's very difficult to understand how the judges can say that it is too difficult to investigate in Afghanistan, so we're not going to investigate it when they have made rulings in other cases. And as the other guests have said, particularly the point that when you're looking at this colonialism, imperialism, the arguments that have been made, serious criticisms of the ICC, and the one case that they fall on is against the United States, and that is really playing into this form of criticism. Yeah, absolutely. A lot about ICC and their role in combating impunity. But Mr. Khouri, I want to bring you back in now on another specific case that doesn't involve the ICC yet anyway, which is that of the murder of a journalist you knew well, Jamal Khashoggi, and what Saudi Arabia is doing, detained 11 people and carrying out a trial in secrecy. We don't know their names. We don't know the charges. And despite the fact that the United States, the CIA and the US Senate believed that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was ultimately responsible, are we going to see him tried over this? Will he face justice for this?
It's unlikely that Mohammed bin Salman will be put on trial anywhere, but that's not really the criterion that we should be looking at. What's fascinating is that he's already had his wings clipped a little bit, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in different ways. The king is taking on some more authority in foreign affairs. The second important thing about Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi killing is that while the American government, Trump in particular, have essentially supported the Crown Prince and said, leave him out of this, the Congress has taken serious action, passing laws about Yemen, about Saudi Arabia, about accountability. And some European governments, the Norwegians, the Germans, others have suspended arms sales and done other symbolic moves. So we're seeing some significant practical actions taken by some elements of major Western governments. But on the whole, there isn't a big direct move to bring Mohammed bin Salman to trial, but we'll have to give this some more time and see how those who are pushing back on him get their work done. Mr.
Bishmawi, I want to bring you in now on another subject that we mentioned at the start of the programme, which is, of course, Syria. Interesting, you know, Omar al-Bashir was in Syria in December meeting Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. We've had the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, reopen their embassies in Syria. And both the United Arab Emirates and Sudan asking the Arab League to allow President Assad back in. Some 500,000 people killed in the Syrian civil war. Is Bashar al-Assad going to face justice?
The file of Syria is really a very painful file because we are talking about really, as you said, hundreds of thousands perhaps of people who were killed, millions perhaps displaced internally and outside the country. And really, the destruction of a country is really enormous. As you know, we are talking about a huge humanitarian and human rights crisis in the country. To me, it's very important that those responsible for what is going on to about 27 million people in that country actually one day face justice. As I said before, I think we have an important framework there, and we are working towards this. We have a commission of inquiry that keeps highlighting various aspects of this, whether it is detention, some executions, death penalty, disappearances, starvation, various aspects of it. We have now the independent, impartial investigative mechanism, what is known as the IIM, which is collecting and recording information. We have the commission of inquiry is identifying perpetrators.
Okay, so what you're saying is that
what is missing here is the judicial mechanism.
Right.
So the judicial aspect.
Okay, Mr. Cadman, I can see you wanted to come in. We don't have very long left in the programme, so I'd like to ask you. So we have framework, judicial mechanisms missing in some places. What is it going to take? What will it take to end impunity for criminals?
Well, very, very quickly, looking at Syria in particular, and I think Mona is quite right in what she's saying in highlighting the role of the Commission of Inquiry and the role of the IIM, the mechanism. Those are really, really important. When you look at Syria, you've got to, a situation such as Syria, you've got to think, we've got to collect the evidence, we've got to safeguard the evidence for future prosecutions. We never thought that Charles Taylor would be held accountable. We never thought that Radovan Karadzic, who has just received life imprisonment, would be held accountable. Those who are responsible in Syria will be held accountable. The ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over Syria. As I said, what we are trying to do now, and we filed at the beginning of March with the prosecutor, which is now being considered, is for the crime of forced deportation, the same as the situation in Myanmar. And our group is hopeful, with the support of the IIM and the Commission of Inquiry, that the prosecutor will be given sufficient evidence to investigate and then potentially bring charges. But what you've got to understand, and I say this having dealt with Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq, Libya, is that we can't expect this to happen overnight. It won't happen overnight. And the majority of the situation is going to fall on Syrians and Syrian institutions over a long period of time. And that's where we also need to be dedicating support. I would like to see the IIM and other institutions providing support to help train Syrian lawyers and judges, because they're the ones that are going to have to deal with this in the long term.
Mr. Cadman, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, even though we have so much to discuss on this. But I'd like to thank all of our guests, Toby Cadman, Rami Khouri in Beirut, and Mona Rishmawi, also here in Doha. Thank you all very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.